So, ex occidente lex, from the West, law. Polybius, a Greek, wrote of the Romans, "How can anyone be so indifferent or idle as to not care to know by what means and under what kind of government almost the whole inhabited world, well as he knew it, was conquered and brought under the dominion of the single city of Rome?" And Rome carried this spark of culture and identity, born in Greece, out across Europe. With blood and fire, with swords and legions, it shaped Western Europe and Eastern Europe in its own image, an image that had been forged under Greek tutelage, frequently literally with Greek tutors. But to the north of Rome was the Etruscans, who were deeply influenced by the Greeks, and had many Greeks living among them. And to the south, the region of southern Italy was called Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece, because so many Greeks were living there. So it should come as no surprise that Rome, from its formation, was shaped by this Western identity that had been forged by the Greeks. And as Greece trapped itself in this death spiral of civil war and became trapped under the empire of the Macedonians and its successor kingdoms, the spread of this identity fell to the Romans. And Horace, a Roman poet, wrote that Greece took captive her uncivilized conqueror. In essence, that Rome may have conquered Greece, but in the end, Greek culture conquered Rome. And Rome is pivotal in our conversation about where we come from, because for 2,000 years, from 753 BCE to 1453 CE, Rome was instrumental in shaping who we are. At its peak, it controlled a quarter of the globe's population. It fielded armies that would be unmatched until the 1800s in Europe. It was industrialized and monetized in a way that wouldn't be matched again until the Industrial Revolution. We can track the output of pollution in the ice caps of Greenland. Rome was pumping so much industrial waste into the air from its lead smelting that we can track it. Allegedly, the plumes that were coming out of these industrial centers in Spain were so thick that birds that would fly through these clouds would fall over dead from the pollution. And while granted, that's a truly horrible thing, it's interesting. And it shows the level of sophistication that the Romans had achieved. And this in some way makes the Romans uniquely identifiable. They lived in apartment blocks. They were sports enthusiasts in a way that baffles even the modern audience. I mean, the worst soccer hooligan riots you hear of in Europe, they have no match to the Nike revolt, which was sparked by chariot races in the Hippodrome of Constantinople. I mean, that left thousands dead and a large swath of the greatest city of the world at that time, Constantinople, in ruins. In the Roman world, we see a unique need for moralizing that really rings true with us today. The United States refuses to think of itself as waging unjust wars. We try to frame whatever we do to give ourselves the moral high ground. If you think about Colin Powell holding up the vial of, the vial that was supposed to represent anthrax, talking about the terror of WMDs and our need to go into Iraq, you can see how we, like the Romans, feel the need to moralize our actions. And Rome was notorious for this. Last year, 2 years ago now, I wrote a speech for my cousin who was getting married. And the speech was about Roman wedding customs. And halfway through my speech I was writing, I realized it was pointless because I was just recapping their wedding. It's all Roman tradition. The ring, the veil, the throwing of rice. I mean, all of our wedding customs are Roman. And it's remarkable that our most treasured rituals, our most treasured vows are Roman. If you think about our college mottos, they're in Latin. Our core principles, our treasured virtues, e pluribus unum, semper fi, these are all Latin. And we use the language of the Romans to add gravitas, to add power to what we say. And that is a remarkable illustration of their legacy. Um, in Rome, we find the first counterculture movement. The generation of Julius Caesar, they belted their togas a little loose. They sagged their togas, if you will. They spoke with an urban dialect, so Clodius became Clodius. The older Romans, they just couldn't understand why these new young rascals just didn't understand the old ways and the old values, and they didn't get what it meant to be a true Roman. In the 60s, when we see the rise of the hippies and this counterculture movement, we feel that it is somehow unique to the American experience, but lo and behold, 2,000 years ago, we're seeing something very close happening in Rome. We see in this ancient society an immigrant culture. Rome was settled by the tired, the hungry, and the poor from other places who came to make a better life in this new city. And in America, that's a very recognizable story. We see upward mobility. We see ambition of immigrants who couldn't make the life they wanted at home, so they come to Rome. We see recognizable fears of moral decay. Perhaps the best example of this was in high school. My best friend came into a family dinner table conversation about Social Security, how Social Security was not looking to be viable in the long run, that they were paying out more than they were bringing in, and yet no politician seemed willing to fix it because it would be political suicide. And Matthew, my friend, added to this conversation that we have reached the point where we can no longer stomach our vices nor their remedy. And my dad was blown away. He thought this was some newspaper columnist, some modern political scientist had summed up the situation so succinctly and so clearly. And he wanted to know, was it the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, where did you find this quote? And it was the Roman historian Livy. 2,000 years ago, these same fears, these same stories were playing out, and they wrapped it up succinctly in a way that we still feel to be powerful. This is the Roman legacy. We see in Rome the first civil rights movement. The plebeians were denied the equivalent of the presidency. They were told they couldn't take part in government, they couldn't have an equal say, and they did essentially the equivalent of a labor strike. They walked out. And the patricians, who were the aristocrats, when faced with this civil disobedience, were forced to rethink their position, and ultimately the plebeians secured all of the political offices that the plebeians had held. And they had the right to marry into the patrician families. We see a civil rights success story that in many ways seems to be the precursor to the American civil rights experience. In Rome, we see so many of our own stories played out. It is remarkable and deeply fascinating. But there is more to this story about why classical history matters than simply it's entertaining. It is our genesis. It is our story. It is the mirror into which we can peer and see ourselves reflected. And by understanding this, we gain access to a thought model that is deeply useful. And in many ways, it's detached from the modern emotional investment, but it has rich parallels. President Truman, is said to have found Plutarch, the Greek biographer, more useful than many of his advisors when trying to determine what was best for the nation. So when he was faced with a hard choice, he would sit down with Plutarch and take the lessons of the past as his guide. In history, we can find lessons of the dangers of a Punic peace, where you punish the people you've conquered rather than try to create peace. And we saw this in World War I with the Treaty of Versailles. And in punishing Germany, we simply ensured there would be a new world war. And like the Second Punic War, our Second World War was far more brutal and far more destructive. And it could have been avoided if we had created peace with our peace treaty rather than punish. We see the power of diversity as Rome tapped into the talent of various places around its empire and gave them a chance to lead. We saw the power that they were able to bring to the table. Some of Rome's greatest emperors came from outside Italy. Hadrian, Trajan, Constantine. These great names were of people who were outside of the normal Roman ethnicity, we would say, but they were full Romans. And the power that diversity offers is made quite clear. We see the power of fear. When we talked about the Greeks in the Peloponnesian War, we saw how fear of what might happen can ensure that it does happen, and it can be so much worse. So, by understanding the past, we understand ourselves, and we understand how we arrived at our values, and we can see how the surrounding context of our current situations is frequently forged by the past. I mean, if you look at gun control, this is a very interesting one. Thomas Jefferson was a deep believer in the Greek hoplite, the yeoman farmer. And in our Minutemen, our militias of the Revolutionary War, we see an echo of this ideal. And Thomas Jefferson deeply believed in it and forged a lot of his policies to reflect this. He saw the Minutemen, the yeoman farmer, as the new hoplite, and that by the force of his musket, he could ensure his civil liberties were protected. And it was with this ideal that the Second Amendment was forged, that for a well-regulated militia, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. And it's important that we keep this in mind because Thomas Jefferson's idealized model, the hoplite farmer, they ended up losing. The hoplites lost to the Macedonian phalanx because technology progressed and the professional soldier became the dominant form of warfare. So it's an interesting question. In theory, to uphold this yeoman farmer ideal, we need to have the rights to bear arms included in Abrams' tank. And clearly that's reducing it to absurdity. But it's important to realize that that was the thought process that was being used. Those were the models that were being followed when we built the Second Amendment. And it's important to think about where that model works and where it doesn't. We can also see America's military policy being hammered out in Rome with Pax Romana, that one dominant military power can ensure peace in its world by making sure that no one else can threaten their neighbors. We see in this ancient model why America has constitutional law. It's straight out of Rome, the 12 Tables. We see how we arrived at our current system. And that is why we should study classical history. That is why it matters.